references to the divine love, but with great difficulty. So I would suggest, first of all, I hope if nothing else this quarter you learn how difficult it is to read exegetical texts. They're difficult for many reasons. One, you have the text itself, which is a challenge. The commentaries, which are often difficult and elliptical, short, or even when they are written at great length, it's hard to know what they're working with or what they're working against. But in addition to that, you have all the resources these commentators are drawing from. They live in a world they've read widely, and they're working off of, building on, drawing language from, working against a whole history of literature. Each stage that we've presented this quarter, and we've worked chronologically, is very much dependent on the stage that came before, for better, for worse. And on top of that, you have the intellectual world of the commentator itself, where the originality comes forth. When Moshe's Alschich, for instance, places transmigration of souls at the center of his master, makes it his master myth. I like this term very much. His master myth, which orients and organizes his exegesis of much of Kohelet, if not all of it. He transforms the text into really a guidebook for the training of the souls, not in this life, but through many lives. Purified one after another. So it's a very difficult literature, which is one of the reasons why it's for me the most fun to work with, because it has all of these challenges attached to it. What I think too, just to throw out some ideas to begin discussion, the 4 categories I suggested earlier in the quarter after Professor Fishbane left us and we were wandering in the realm of complexity, in Tohu, waiting for the light to return from the east. Here we are at the end of the west, waiting for the light to return from the east.
It's coming.
4 things, at least from the historian's perspective, that help to really control and think about movement over time. One, the literary form of the commentaries. And I suggested that a colleague of mine once said there are 2 types of commentaries, those with introductions and those without. And that simple difference really says a lot about the literary tradition that you're working with. In Ashkenaz, in Tzarfat, they didn't have introductions, or at least not in the Hellenistic style. And it points to, or it opens up a different way of relating to the text. Much more through tradition, much less through the eye of the author who writes the introduction. In the Islamic world especially, and then in Spain, bless you, and then continuing the Spanish tradition going into southern France, Italy, and then back around to Salonika and elsewhere, there are lengthy introductions, very self-conscious introductions, that in a way determine your reading of the text before you even begin. A lot of the work is done in the introduction, and so pay very close attention to the introductions, what they write, how they write, what they want you to get, what the master myth is that they're setting forth to organize your reading of the text. In many ways, what the master myth they're setting forth to help resolve the contradictions that the rabbis were so fond of remarking on in the biblical text of Kohelet. So literary form, preface in particular, but not only, the way that commentaries are organized, sometimes thematically, mostly verse by verse. The methods used, and we've seen many methods, and if you start to look for patterns historically, you will find them, at least in a more general sense. But we've noticed use of midrash, grammar, lexicography, use of rhetorical techniques to connect verse to verse to try and work toward understanding the work as a consistent argument. The logical methods developed in the Maimonidean tradition and the explication of scripture through homonyms, equivocal terms, and reading for parables, to the Zoharic reading through Sfirot, even without the grid, but through connecting the biblical text to matching it up with the cosmic grid. These 2 texts, which are mirror images of each other, one might argue. The biblical text and the cosmic grid, or perhaps a doorway opening up to that world. But what you see, perhaps, and I think we've seen it in our readings throughout the quarter, is midrash, pshat, rhetoric, linguistic readings, and then in the 13th century we really come back to midrash. The 13th century, one might argue, is distinctive more than any reason for the revival of midrash. as the key hermeneutical lens through which Jews were reading the text. That applies to Kabbalists and philosophers. Both suddenly in the 13th century were interested in developing their readings not directly in response to the biblical text, but indirectly through the authoritative rabbinic text. Ironically, it did not control the readings, but open them up much more widely, because Midrash provided not the final say on scriptural text, but more inspiration for even more creative readings of the biblical text. It was a prod going forward. So literary form, method, sources, Midrash philosophy, drawing from different philosophical traditions to read into the text, scientific tradition, trying to harmonize the scriptural text with whatever is current of the day, has a lot to do with how commentaries come out on the other end. They're really writing a new commentary in light of a new intellectual reality, and they are forced, quite literally, to confront the biblical text in a new way, in a fresh way. And so all of these revolutions of reading really could be argued, could be suggested that they are really attempts to grapple with a text that no longer makes sense in a different world, in a new world that requires rereading. And themes was the fourth general category I set forth. Literary form, method, source, and theme.
Okay.
And you can add to this, which I hope you will. Theme. And theme is the fun stuff once you get through all the hours of research trying to make sure you understand what these exegetes are actually saying. But then to start focus on themes. Which verses they're concentrating their interest in, and it changes always. Every exegete really concentrates on a different part of the biblical text, where that exegete thinks the solutions are to understanding the book as a whole. And it's usually connected with a basic theme or more than one. And you see this throughout the literature that we've read. The rabbis, of course, had everything. They explored from every perspective, but the medievals tended to try and produce a scholastic reading. So the Karaites read Kohelet for the most part through the last few verses. They read it as pious skepticism, ascetic withdrawal, realization that you really can't understand anything except through divine wisdom. Therefore, fear God, observe the commandments, for that's the all of man. And it runs through all of this literature, despite how diverse it is, that really is the end point always. Ibn Khiyat, in Islamic Spain, reads it in almost exactly the opposite way. Not pious skepticism and ascetic withdrawal, but embracing philosophy and wisdom as the key to purifying the soul and allowing it to ascend to the celestial realm. He has a strongly Neoplatonic reading of the scriptural text, which comes out nicely in the verse we focused on, Hizaher b'ni asot sfarim ein ketz, which, contrary to the Karaites who read this as a proscription on reading foreign books, beware, my son, the making of books, the making of foreign books, the reading of foreign books without end. Ibn Khiyat has, at least from my perspective as historian of philosophy, his wonderful alternative reading. Hizaher b'ni colon asot sfarim ein ketz, be exhorted, my son, make books without end, which she connects with the principle of acquiring as many philosophical books as possible, reading them all, because that's the only way Solomon suggests one can achieve perfection. Ibn Ezra, you read it on your own, we didn't go through it much, but it really places the emphasis on the beginning of chapter 3 of Kohelet, the catalog of times, and the problem of chance, determinism, free will reverberates throughout his text, and really throughout much of his exegetical corpus. It is his master myth, is this problem of astral influence. He was an astrologer, as all knows, but he wasn't only a practicing astrologer who produced textbooks for the scholars of southern France. It really animated much of his work. And you can find as much astrology in his biblical commentaries as in his straightforward astrological handbooks. Ibn Tibbon read Kohelet through Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, as a dialogue. He solved the contradictions by not solving them, by suggesting that the contradictions in Kohelet are actually different voices arguing with each other. Those who argue for the contemplative life as the highest aim, those who argue for the active life as the highest aim of human existence. For him, really, Kohelet 3:18 through 22 are the verses that provide the key for understanding the whole text, and not only the text, but how one ought to live one's life. Does the soul of man rise above? Can one achieve immortality, and what does that mean for the way one organizes his text? Ibn Latif had different thematics entirely. If one pushes his cosmic cycles, perhaps he read Kohelet in relation to a different conception of the cosmos, repeating itself in other ways. Ibn Latif is hard to figure. Zohar is even harder to figure. And one would have to go through really every citation and see what they do. But in the simplest sense, what Zohar does, in the most creative way, and now I'm getting in a difficult ground, but in the most creative way, is transform Kohelet into a work of metaphysics beyond anything the philosophers could think of. It's not only the study of metaphysics; it is metaphysics. It is the divine realm, and Kohelet either teaches it or is it. It represents, I would argue, Kohelet, Shira, Shirim, and Proverbs are three of the Sfirot, which emanate themselves, or which reflect the processes of the divine, the very complex dynamic of the divine world. And then Alschich, as we know from today, makes reincarnation as the theme, which, like many of these texts, is reviving a rabbinic reading. Rabbinic reading of Kohelet 1:4 is pointing to the secret of resurrection. A generation goes and a generation comes, and earth remains forever. The rabbis understood as an oddity, and they played off of it. A generation should come first and then go, not go first and then come. So why does it say it that way? It points to the secret of resurrection. It points to repeated generations returning after they've already passed away. In the 13th century already they pick up on this motif, and Nachmanides, in his Drashal Divrei Kohelet, which we didn't read, says quite explicitly that Kohelet 1:4 points to Sod HaGilgul, the secret of transmigration of souls. Alschich picks up on it and runs with it, and works that into his reading of the book throughout. So literary form, methods, sources, but especially themes, help to organize this mass material and put it in some sort of meaningful relation from a historical perspective, chronologically, throughout history. It can be read in different ways, but this is a starting point for our final discussion on how one might make sense of exploring the history of exegesis.
It's pretty comprehensive, so I don't have a lot to add in terms of the structure. I would only respond more on the personal side, and that is that what fascinates me about all of this is really the archaeology of the imagination. And this brings together themes in the way that Professor Robinson was articulating that. That is to say that what we see in every single one of these cases is the way the multitude of sources, how each of the interpreters enter the interpretive circle of any particular verse. Where they find the opening, where they read against the grain, where they find the word to have to be transformed. And then the way that imagination may have to utilize other kinds of sources to produce its creative possibilities. And as these texts accumulate, obviously the reader creates kind of dynamic syntheses at the same time that he's trying to move things towards a specific intellectual or spiritual goal. So I'm always personally very much interested in the way the interpreter opens up the text in an unexpected way, reads against the grain, or turns the metaphors into something more concrete, or the concrete into metaphor, and does this in multiple ways, and then works with the tradition to create a certain kind of understanding of what the larger intention of the text is. There's an assumption that these texts intend something, that they're part of a divine intelligence that's teaching, or in Solomon's case, in Kohelet, the wisest of the wise is teaching something, and the task of the interpreter is to enter into, try to perceive what that spiritual or educational or larger intention is. And then it's a question in some cases of how much the interpreter will open up, even as the interpreter is trying to reveal, how the interpreter conceals. And that would depend, or how much is left laconic and how much is opened up. So that voice, I think what's particularly interesting is also one of the points that Professor Robinson was indicating is in some ways in which certain texts play off the voice of the interpreter versus the larger argument that interpreters are being brought voice to voice to create a much larger argument, whether it's the particular voices in the Midrash that are trying to enter into the other voice of Scripture, or it's the particular individual voice of the interpreters in the Middle Ages who begin to pose themselves as prisms, ways of speaking through the texts in a particular way. So I'm simply running alongside that fourfold schema that Professor Robinson has given, and just trying to indicate that aspect which is constantly fascinating me to enter in, or to try to work with the interpreter, who has in many ways has an intent. The intention precedes the exegesis, and then it's revealed through the exegesis, and how the text is considered to be a teaching voice, I think is, for me, a fundamental way in, and that it's not necessarily always the coherence of the particular verse is worked out through the exposition of the exegesis, but the biblical text is a multiplicity of voices of these verses, or as we've seen in this particular case, even parts of the verses intend to be different parts of an argument. So it's an endlessly fascinating way to enter into intellectual and spiritual history through this master narrative, or this master text, which becomes this prism. So you understand the whole culture through these prisms, and I think that's probably certainly one of the reasons why Professor Robbins has been teaching some of these texts through one particular book, because they become refractions in very fascinating ways. So I think we should open it up to see what has surprised you, or what you learned. I'd be curious to say what surprised you the most, what you learned and didn't expect to learn. What is your takeaway as you go forward as interpreters? Be curious to.
And as paper writers.
Yeah, right. I mean, like when you chose your topic, or as you're choosing your topic, as you hope to choose a topic, like what are the considerations that interest you, that are of intellectual interest in terms of your larger intellectual project as a person, right? Like, how do you see it serving the way you're learning how to think through interpretation? Anybody have any thoughts about that? David?
Well, I'm trying to work on two themes. I mean, even Latif has two of those themes within him. That's his philosophical writing and his mystical writings, presumably mystical and not philosophical. Presumably. And the way he interprets verses from Kohelet philosophically, and the other way around, presumably the way he interprets the same verses or other verses in Kohelet.
So what you're choosing to study is really a kind of a problematic that you're trying to think through as a second order reading
Right.
of that reading. In other words, the question that you're choosing to focus on is a question of your own interest. So you're not only taking the interpreter's interest, but you're trying to go one other level, and because you're interested in how these things come together.
Oh, and I would add that I think when we work through chronological development on the commentary on Kohelet, they're either working alongside the text, but from outside, and for example, in the Joshua rabbinic text, certainly work alongside the text, internally justifying its existence in the Jewish curriculum, or just working on that text from the outside as we go on later on.
So,
writings are working on this same ambiguity, right? They're either referring to internal notions, but then they're things that are not in the text at all, or not even in the curriculum.
But that's part of, I think that's that issue. You and we are trying to be interpreters of interpreters, and so that meta-interpretation is also saying something of the agenda of questions that we're trying to deal with. Even if you're trying to be a straight historian, the way you would organize that is an interpretation of interpretation.
And even if you're trying to be a historian, you still always have the question, why something new now, what it's responding to, what's triggering it, and why, in your case, is someone changing his readings in different context. Is it development of the author, is it change in his time, or is it something about his relation with the text? And to say what Professor Fishman was saying in a slightly different way, what is really contributing to these, to this extraordinary work of imagination that's going on constantly in the exegetical tradition? How much does the text contribute to this? And how much, the relation between reader and text, and between reader and his surroundings? And so why is he changing? Why are they different in different places?
Is it only a trigger just to talk about other things?
Right, or is there something going on in his relation with the text?
How about some other people? Okay, great.
I'm thinking about the legal writings, and I think the only verse that's used significantly in legal discourses is Me'uvat lo yuchal leitzkon, which is used in a bunch of contexts about where people have missed an opportunity to do a mitzvah and then just can't do it anymore because it's the time is past or it's undoable in some way. And that's pretty much the only one that's used more than once in any halachic material that I can find. And I think that's really interesting because it's kind of weird that needs a proof text at all, to say that once you've missed the time for doing something, you can't do it. And I think so I'm working on trying to understand what's going on with that.
Very nice. That's very interesting. It's actually one of the, slightly later, but one of the arguments for the transmigration of souls was not just you have to repair certain kinds of things, but sometimes you live at different historical periods and you can't fulfill all the commandments. You can't, if you weren't living in Israel, you couldn't do Shemitah, right?
Who is saying?
Next lifetime.
Right?
Next
Didn't
slide.
someone say you don't have to do all the any mitzvot outside of Israel? Doesn't Ramban say that?
But the Kabbalistic tradition was, there are a lot of interesting Kabbalistic traditions, particularly going to the 17th century and others, where part of the issue of completing the commandments in perfection is what the Buddhists would say is to escape the wheel of rebirth. In other words, when you perfect yourself, you enter into a perfected realm and you're not born again. but there may be a lot of commandments. Then part of the issue would be, can you perform the commandments mentally if you can't do them physically? But there are attempts to complete, if everybody has the duty to complete the commandments, how could you do that? Your question is asking a very interesting halachic question, like if you miss the moment, is it gone forever?
Yeah, and it's also
And you don't have the case of what the rabbis would call a tefillat nidava. The rabbis can solve that problem legally through a tefillat nidava. You do something just as a spontaneous gift statement, but then you could add on things that you've missed. But you're dealing with,
Yeah, I feel like that's interesting because I feel like that test could also be used as an argument for, like, against the transmigration of souls. Like that would be more intuitive to me to say, if you messed something up in your first life, like.
you have a chance. Yeah, you can do it next mincha. You can do it the next life. You have a mincha will always come back again.
Yeah.
It's also really interesting that that's the only thing that comes up in Alschich.
Is that the only one? It's the only one that I found.
Where did you find the discussion?
That one is in Sukkah, about eating, whether if you miss the chance to eat in the Sukkah the first night of Sukkot, and
So what? And you say yafeh be'ito. What is the phrase that they use?
משלח חל ליום טוב הראשון, אין לדבר תשלומים. ועל זה נאמר, מעוות לא יוכל לתקון.
Wow. So they understand ma'uvat in a very, really in a more metaphorical sense.
Yeah, and Chagiga uses it about if you, about a child born of like a problematic sexual union, so that they're not there.
Right. Or like a mamzer or something like that.
They have a holy union and a mamzer.
Okay.
And then some about a bunch about tefillah.
Right.
There are a couple other psukim that are used like once in the Gemara.
So it would be interesting to see if you could find out in places if the Kabbalistic tradition was trying to comment on Me'uvat because they're using Litkon, and cases of that nature, how that tikkun would in fact be able to be done. Right? I don't know whether that text is commented on in the Zohar halachically. But it would be interesting because then. But are they saying that something me'uvat, a misdeed, let's say in the loosest sense, a misdeed has no. Because one would say a misdeed has no repair. The other is a monstrosity, a monstrous deed can't be corrected. Right? So you have they're on two different ends of the spectrum.
Well, I feel like I think the implication of using that verse about one thing that you can't do, about saying that like this verse applies to if you miss your chance to eat in the sukkah, like I think really implies that like the vast majority of mitzvot, if you don't do them right, you do have time. Like I don't think that those are totally misplaced.
Right. Yeah. All right. So, but part of what you're indicating is that the problem that's striking you is a much larger problem that you're zeroing in on, and so your agenda is helping you see what you about that. Yeah, nice.
Other projects in development?
I was in reading over. So Professor Fishman suggested that I look at Rashom's commentary, and in reading over Rashom's commentary, I noticed he's sort of understood as being one of the most sort of literalistic commentators, and indeed that is very much the case. This thing is like really sparse, but one of the things that I found that was sort of even more elegant than the rest of it in its sparseness is the way that they deal with the very sort of graphic description of the degradation of the body in the first part of chapter 12.
Yeah, that becomes and the Midrash has the famous case of the 12 stages of the life of the person, right?
Yes.
You lose control of your body.
Old age.
Yeah, you lose
Old age and death.
Yeah, but the amazing thing about this, right? There's like the question of like potentially there being these 10 rulers are mentioned, In 719, which is not of chapter 12, the one other sort of salient mention of degradation of the body is the body is sort of an instrument of sinfulness, and they mention this thing of 10 rulers, and then all of a sudden Rashi provides this understanding of like this dealing with parts of the body being instruments of sin. Rashbam doesn't really pick up on this, but then both of them deal in 12:1 through 7 with. So they both understand, obviously, at least on a sort of first-order interpretation, as this is the way that the body, begins to crumble, kind of thing. And the imagery is pretty obvious. There's the teeth falling out and all this, and they both kind of deal with it in similar ways. It appears as though in some places Rashbam is directly citing Rashi, but what he does that's really striking is that in Rashi's interpretation, and Rashbam was his grandson, and he sort of makes reference at various points to using his grandfather's interpretations and things like that, is that in Rashi's there's an extra, a sort of almost excursus, like a different, it's not like a davar affair, it's like a completely different interpretation of everything going on, and it has to do with 1 through 7 providing this kind of mini history of Torah before and after the exile by means of citations of multiple verses on top of one another. I think that there's something really bizarre happening here. So that, first off, Rashbam's decision, we know that he had Rashi's commentary, and there's no question about this, but the decision to sort of remove that and stick only to the very physical description of physical degradation was a really interesting one, and I think it does speak to their vastly different understandings of what both the kind of metaphysical as well as physical stakes of the body degrading and returning to dust are, because both of them deal with this motif of returning to dust pretty much every time it appears in Kohelet. They talk about it. But Rashi's extended discourse using this kind of amazing new body of citations and the way that it's completely, Rashi just doesn't deal with it. It just doesn't.
He probably was younger.
Sorry. One wonders whether
It might be an age thing.
Hanging out and he's like, oh yeah, my teeth are falling out. This is the case.
Right.
But there's something sort of astonishing about this miniature history pre and post exile that Rashi seems to be able to pull out of really a relatively sparse base text, and that then it is sort of summarily jettisoned by his grandson in this really interesting way. And I guess what I'm thinking about this was that I was reading over what Rashi does with this. The thing that sort of immediately made me sort of jump into this business was that the way that this history was constructed, the way that the building blocks of this were sort of were put together, was increasingly detailed and sort of nitpicky bits of citation from the Bible, such that Kohelet becomes, the degradation of the human body in Kohelet becomes a receptacle for sort of citation, creating this kind of multi-meaning, double interpretation on Rashi's part of what, when you're reading the end of Kohelet, it's like, oh yes, there is a bit of a discourse on old age here, great, moving on, but the way that it's picked up and turned into this
so the voice,
of exilic history.
Right.
But interesting too, they're both reading it as mashal, though, those verses.
Right.
But mashal, so both doing in a way shot work through mashal in completely different ways.
Right.
And there's an argument that Rashbam Shrat is not only literalistic but naturalistic, and so this element of the naturalistic seems to be part of that.
That makes a lot of sense. I kind of wonder sort of one would never be able to really figure this out, but in terms of, the question of sort of Rashi to Rashbam is, and the sort of tradition history of it, the way that these things are transmitted and understood, one wonders kind of what the process is by which these dual interpretations are sort of provided to the younger commentator, and the younger commentator says, I'm going to jettison the one that doesn't have to do with the physical body.
Right, but since I'm the historian in the room, look sideways too. the 12th century is that century in exactly that place where the Book of God and the Book of Nature came together.
Yeah.
And so the new readings of the literalistic readings of the Book of God correspond with a new scientific empiricism related to the Book of Nature.
Right.
And it's everywhere in that context.
Yeah, they use
And
like
that would fit with
terms-
Rashbam very nicely.
the like French sort of terms for like bones and things, like Alschich, for example, like in terms of what exactly it is that the legs are doing when they're starting to...
The key term for Rashbam in that context is derech eretz,
Right.
by which he means the natural way of the world.
The way, right, exactly. That's, right.
That's what he means specifically. It's not the traditional understanding, but that's the way he understands.
So that's, yeah.
Dan?
I have a similar project on the book of asceticism that he asked, is that he actually has a sort of miniature history of prophecy and then when it stopped and then how it was sort of picked up by the rabbis, and the rabbis as not imaginative writers, but interpretive writers have more authority. What's interesting is that Ibn Riyad's version, especially like the metaphysical aspect of how prophetic consciousness is transmitted to the people of Israel, and how the rabbis use their sort of rational or intellectual capacities to take meaning out of that, is very similar to Spinoza's way of interpreting prophecy in the theological political treatise. But what's the big difference is that Ibn Riyad is obviously coming from a religious standpoint. Spinoza is coming from a very irreligious standpoint, and almost seems to use his history of scripture based on scripture itself to ridicule the rabbinic tradition of how the Torah was written by Moses and how prophecy was sort of like passed on. So many working sort of with the Neoplatonic basis of that, and maybe comparing Riyad's miniature history to Spinoza and Maimonides' and guidance and
Right. Spinoza always makes everything complicated. But it's very, very interesting. The question that you want to ask, and this is one of the questions to keep in mind related to what I mentioned about literary form. Many of these commentators write introductions and then they comment on the text. What is the relation between what they say in their introduction and how they actually apply it in the text? So maybe it would be worthwhile not only to focus on the preface, but to see if
They
these
follow
ideas
through,
play out and how they play out through his reading of the text. That would be quite fun.
One of the weird things is with Ibn Riyad, though, is that though he talks about that tradition at the very beginning, at the very end, where you should see sort of a some commentary on the verse, like, initial day, like the Torah, and, do the mitzvot. He doesn't really talk about that at all, which seems very strange for someone who seems very committed to connecting the Jewish people to the older prophetic history and Israel. It seems to sort of not be there at all.
Right. So is the commentary a different book than the introduction? Do they operate on different levels? Is he doing different things with them? Or does it play? That will be very fun to see. Oh, very nice. All right. You are on your way to writing wonderful papers. Other projects developing? Aliwa.
You've been photographing pages.
Unless I get someone else to give me the whole book. Anyway, so I was focusing on the two seemingly contradictory verses on women in 7:27-26 of woman as bitter as death.
You can't just coming back to that, huh?
Yeah. Well, actually, I might want to focus on this because
Persian women will always do that.
I'm a woman regardless of my other ethnicities. Anyways, but this is really interesting because he decides to understand women literally in 7 when it comes to that women being evil and seducing men and being cause a lot of trouble versus when you should, the woman that you love is your soul. So that's very interesting.
Yeah,
actually.
so like when he chooses to go one direction or the other, right?
When you more pshatic.
Interesting. Very interesting, yeah.
But so, I mean, I don't have a coherent thesis now. So far, I'm just finding interesting things that I need to put together in a coherent way. Like right now, it's very interesting, like the connection between woman and death, and woman is Mar Mimavet's.
So how they Mar Mimavet more than,
exactly.
or
And then you have in Shir Shirim, you have Ki Azak Kemavet Ha'ava. That love is as strong as death. So there's a lot of relations, and then the live with the woman that you love because that's your chalkecha and this kol yimei havlecha. But I also, another interesting parallel, which I don't think a commentator, that not that I've found has picked up on, that there's the Aisha Asher Ahavtecha, and then the only other place that there's Asher Ahavtecha is in Hashem says that to Yitzchak, Kachna Bincha Asher Ahavtecha. So there might be some interesting parallels there. And then I want to focus on humanity. I'm not really sure. I'm not sure what I'm doing 100% yet. But another area.
But I think if you're focusing like on Isha Mar Mimavet, be interested to see the citations he uses and how he develops the argument. So if you would simply to play off, yeah, let's say if you played that off against Isha Asher Ahavta, but then the issue would be to see how those arguments are developed in relationship to a much larger theme, and how he sees those in relationship to the developing rhetoric of his text, because he may be at a certain juncture in his discussion. You know, I'm sure he's misogynist probably because
he says even Shlomo, it's in feminine because Shlomo himself has become a weak woman. Yeah.
Interesting. So it'd be interesting to see actually one way would be to see the perception of the feminine as a thematic throughout his work, and then how that is developed in different kinds of rhetorical contexts, right?
And this whole idea of Solomon becoming a woman is connected with a motif in rabbinic discourse that we haven't brought up at all this quarter, is the idea growing out of Ecclesiastes 1:12 that Solomon was king and is no longer, and that he was deposed, some argue, by the demon Ashmodai, and that he wrote Kohelet after he had been deposed of his kingdom, reflecting regretfully on the decisions he's made, mainly too many horses and foreign women, that led to the splitting of the kingdom. So it's a historicizing reading, building off of a hyper literal understanding of
so that's already in the
112.
Midrash.
That's already in the Midrash.
Should go back and take a look.
But these historicizing readings of, say, this, that he's become feminized and weak, is probably working off of that historical motif that's already in Midrashic text.
Also it's just interesting to see how much, like, the text itself has led to so many different interpretations, and shot-wise, I can think of many feminist interpretations of it that everyone has to view it in this very negative historic light, which is kind of interesting, because I don't think inherently if you pick things out, you can...
Right, of course.
Dov?
I was just going to comment on this, that this isn't that related, but at Passover time, somebody pointed me to a medieval Italian commentator on the Haggadah, which said that often they would be impoverished and wouldn't have enough money to afford the bitter herb, the maror, and they were pointing in the Seder when meant to point to various things. And instead, if you don't have maror, you should point to your wife. Because of that verse.
No, it actually appears in some of the Haggadahs an actual...
One of the more forgettable interpretations. You don't have to remember everything, though.
And when you want to point at your avadim, you also point to your wife.
Something you can't forget.
Oh my God. All right. Is it true? I heard that. Is it true?
But Dov, thoughts
not.
at the end of the course and related to your project? You were going to move in a new direction. You have some ideas?
Yes, a new direction. I've got a couple of possibilities percolating, but the primary one is more expository, to go back to the Midrash and back to take a section of Midrash Rabbah and do an expository on the ambiguities that it's playing off, the exegetical mechanics that it's using, And I mentioned to Dr. Fishburne I might want to do some interpretive work as well, kind of more Lebanese, looking at the structural underpinnings, what's the ideology of this.
Of Kohelet or of Midrash Kohelet? Of Kohelet.
Of Midrash.
Of Midrash.
That's my thinking. That seems sensible.
Right.
Awful.
Right.
Terrible.
Well, that would be trying to understand the redactional, the compositional aspects of the redactor, and to see whether there is a kind of theology in the redaction.
And that, I think they argue that's very late, that the Josh Rabbi Kohelet is very late. So you might want to look at Kohelet Sutta too, just to have something to compare it. At least for me, I have a hard time reading anything if you can't read it compared to something else. So, the problem of history. But Kohelet Sutta and Kohelet Rabbah Kohelet Sutta and Kohelet Rabbah are, I think, from around the same time. And so are different approaches to redaction. And that probably represents different ideas of what the text should mean or ought to mean.
You don't think a text would have an inherent meaning carrying it? I mean, this was goes back to the debate the two professors had in the first class about whether you can, a text has a real reading. Or original.
I tend to think in relative terms, and that's why I think any text needs to be read in relation to another text, because it's defined through the process of reading. But
I would argue the opposite, at least even in this case, simply that you would want to see what the redactional structure is. I mean, the comparative issue would be illuminating, but it would seem that you could take a unit from Kohelet Rabbah and see the redactor as a theologian, a literary theologian, and how was there any intention, or could you read it in a coherent way? I mean, it's a little bit easier to do it for the Stam and the Gemara and the way Levinas would do this but the fact is that in many cases of the Midrash, the collection of diversity was a way to complexify a reading by specifically integrating a number of diverse readings, and that also tells us something because they're trying to give some coherence to the multiplicity that came down, but to do it in a very particular way. So that, that's not, I think we could learn a lot comparatively, but that unit itself could be self-standing, I would think.
right, well, in defense of the comparative approach, what it does is show you what he could have done differently. So you have a text, and that's what it is, but every decision made in the collection of those materials could have been a different decision.
Right.
So the very choice is responding to a certain opportunity.
That's true. I mean, but do I need another text to show me the alternatives, or could I just imagine it being different and see the choices he's making on his own?
Well, again, this will be different opinions, but the imagination of what could be different is your imagination in the 21st century, and not the options available in the 9th.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's the historian's perspective. Sorry.
No, I believe there's a dove. He says, "Hamachriya b'neihem." So
Tara, you're looking nervous over here to the right.
No, I'm not nervous. I thought I was going to write on the Zohar. I actually started, but now I'm maybe going to do this thing because I'm interested in them reading a theology and spirituality in it because everyone does, but in some way. But, explicitly in the biblical text, it's not really there, like a sense of spiritual afterlife and what you can do, that sort of thing. And so I just think Kohelet's very fascinating that you have that one line that mentions that, but it's a question. It's like, does man's spirit go up or not? And so I think that everyone somehow reads a sense of, it's not an option for it to be a doubtful question to anybody. It's always, it does matter and there is life.
but it's perceiving spiritual purpose, but then how you act that out in your life. He's,
Yeah.
he's not only giving the contemplative insight, but also the praxis. He's telling how this is a book of not only reflection, but the praxis of what you have to do to achieve it. Right? It's not simply a book that you reflect on, or the truth that you reflect on, but he's giving you the guidance of what you have to do in fact to do that. So it's spiritual perfection that has to be achieved
Exactly.
through study and performance.
I think the pulling theology out of it is just a good move to study, because you could obviously read Kohelet as a confusion, as a, what really matters, I don't know what to think, and everyone chooses to read it as actually a guide in some way instead of skeptical.
Very nice. Jacob, you're the last one on the
Oh, I just have a new thought from today. Since my general interest is in the shot tradition, I didn't know that there was another point in medieval exegesis where there was this development of commentators writing in every book in the way we talked about today. So that was new for me, and perhaps point of comparison.
Between two different kinds of commentaries.
two different types.
I mean, it might, or maybe to see, there are a number of places, for example, even the text we dealt with today, where he cites, let's say, Psalms, but he gives the rabbinic interpretation. You might see how he comments that in his own commentary on Psalms, or the difference between when he's using it at one level and when he's using it in another purpose. So that might be a comparative dimension, different strategies in different cases.
There are really three, if you include Sfat in it, but Sfat is a complicated Pshat tradition. Well, four, really. I mean, the Karaite Pshat revolution, Spanish Pshat, French Pshat, and then early modern Pshat. So other comments as we move to the very end of the quarter? Thoughts, comments, reflections, concerns, anxiety?
The anxiety, well, when should we have the papers due? I guess only people who need to do it right away is those who want to get a graduate.
So you need it in by the end of next week, I think, or even early. Grades have to be in by 7.
What I did for you might be able to do for Emily. You see her early this week.
Or you can do it.
You can, yeah. But you give a provisional grade.
Right, yeah, so but the end of next, I can probably have it in by Monday, but end of next week would be excellent if possible. Then technically all of our grades have to be in by the 6th, which is Saturday.
Well, I would have
Yeah,
to.
they would have to be earlier. Grades have to be in by the 6th.
No, exactly.
I have a form and I can give it to you that I already.
Oh, yeah, I can do it online.
Oh,
So it's very
okay, as a provisional grade.
Yeah.
And then either of us can read the paper, but I.
Yeah, no, it's very easy to do online.
Oh,
I can do it online for
okay.
both. If
Okay,
you want.
because I did it for Dover.
Just send the papers.
What?
We can send them to both of you, right?
Yes, send them all
please.
electronically.